And now I'm very delighted to invite to the podium a man who is a Crockett to my Tubbs, the Maverick to my Goose. He is a thinker, he is curious, he is a wonderful, well-spoken human being, and he's one of the greatest New York City magicians I've ever met in my life. Jerry Oystrom is here to introduce the 2014 Julian Simon Award winner.
Thank you, Kennedy. That's very generous. I know a lot of great New York City magicians, and I'm not one except by mistake once in a while. Hi, everybody. Boy, what a great crowd. And I want to start by first thanking Fred and Lawson and CEI for the honor of introducing tonight's Julian Simon Memorial Award dinner, our good friend John Tierney. And John, by the way, has brought his 15-year-old son, Luke. They call him Libertarian Luke. So welcome to the CEI family, Luke. And it's indeed an honor to introduce John. Most of us were first introduced to Julian Simon's seminal work through John's terrific 1990 New York Times piece, Betting the Planet, a story that many of you know, which bears some repeating. The title, of course, refers to the famous bet between Simon and the apocalyptic ecologist, Paul Ehrlich, on how commodity prices might fare given allegedly depleting resources. Ehrlich himself selected the materials, 5 metals, and these metals are actually etched into the trophy itself. Dare we call them the Ehrlich etchings? Betting that their prices would rise across the board from greater scarcity. Simon, of course, took the opposite optimistic view, and 10 years later, all 5 metals had declined substantially in price, winning the bet for Simon, and exactly for the reason that he said they would. Human ingenuity, the ultimate resource, as he so aptly put it. Julian Simon was a visionary, and equally important, an empiricist and an iconoclastic thinker. It's not well known that it was Simon who conceived the solution to the problem of oversold airline flights and bumped passengers, a market solution we now take for granted and which has contributed an estimated $100 billion to the economy and still counting. Our honoree tonight, John Tierney, follows in Simon's legacy. A self-described liberal in college who first considered a career in mathematics, it was empirical data, in no small part due to Simon's research, which converted John to the classical liberal perspective he has today. John's 1996 cover story in the New York Times Magazine, "Recycling is Garbage," echoes John's iconoclasm and set the record, as many of you know, for the Times' largest volume of letters to the editor ever received. And given the article's thesis, you can imagine the tone of some, if not most, of those letters. John's recent best-selling book, Willpower, again echoes Simon in its counterintuitive insights into what willpower is and what it is not. I urge you to pick it up. It can change your life, and I mean that. But John is not merely a man of letters. He's a man of action as well. Simon's famous bet inspired John in 2005 to offer his own wager, $5,000, shared jointly with Simon's widow, Rita, on future oil prices. 5 years later, John won the bet hands down when oil had risen nowhere near the wager's threshold of $200 a barrel, and of course still hasn't come close. John is also a man of the street. He spent a night in the Flophouse in the Bowery to expose the harm regulations were actually imposing on the poor and the homeless. And he posed as a homeless man himself, sleeping on the street outside Hillary Clinton's home after she had criticized Mayor Giuliani for removing the homeless from the streets. But most of all, and in poignant tribute to Julian Simon's legacy, John is a man of the people, our ultimate resource. His article about a chronic pain patient serving 25 years on drug charges led directly to the patient's freedom from prison. And his series on mass incarceration inspired President Obama's commutation of life sentences on 2 occasions for individuals wrongly incarcerated. Julian Simon once said, "The real issue isn't caring about nature, but about people," an ideal which tonight's winner continues to advance resolutely. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in congratulating and welcoming to the podium John Tierney.
Jerry, that was awfully nice of you. Thank you. And thank you, CEI, for this prize named after a man who has meant so much to me. The most fruitful phone call of my journalism career happened back in the 80s, our theme for tonight, when I was assigned to do a story on the population crisis in Kenya. And I'd heard about this kind of economist with oddball views, so I called up Julian Simon, and I recited to him these awful statistics from Kenya that it was the fastest growing country in history. The average woman was having 8 children. The population was going to double in 17 years. And Julian interrupted me and said, "Yes, isn't it wonderful that so many people can be alive in that country today?" And this kind of stopped me, but it was the start of a beautiful friendship. Julian really changed the way I looked at the world. And the most important lesson that he taught me, that I've applied to everything really that I've done in journalism, has been when the latest crisis comes along, to follow Julian's principle, which is don't look just at the problem, look at the trend. That was how Julian looked at the world. And I found when I started doing that, no matter what I was writing about, whether it was garbage or polar bears or the price of oil, that when you looked at the trend tended to be positive, and Julian was right, and the doomsayers were wrong. Now, what frustrated me in this is that I also noticed that no matter how often one pointed this out, the doomsayers kept talking. You could not shut Paul Ehrlich up. And this question consumed me: how do we spread Julian's message? How do we get people to start looking at that? And that's really the question that I'm working on now, which is, I'm doing another book with Roy Baumeister, my Willpower co-author. One of his most important papers in psychology was about the power of bad things, why we overreact to bad news, why we tend to put too much credence in apocalyptic prophecies. And our hope is to show people how to take Julian Simon's perspective, how to look at the good long-term trends in life, how to look at the good long-term trends in the world, how to avoid reacting to scaremongers by passing needless regulations and giving them more power at the expense of the rest of us. Now, I know that's not going to be an easy task, but I am heartened tonight as I look out and think of something that Julian said to me at a CEI event in 1980. This was on Earth Day. It was Earth Day 1990. And this was, Paul Ehrlich had just lost his bet, and yet he was shamelessly addressing a large crowd on the mall, peddling his usual doom and gloom. Julian was addressing a CEI symposium, and when he got up to speak, there were only 16 people in the audience, but it did not faze him. He kind of waved at the Ehrlich event, and he said, "Well, there's more people across the street, but we're happier." And that's the way I feel tonight. There's a lot more than 16 people here tonight. That is a positive, long-term trend for Julian's message. I predict it's going to happen. I tell you, I am filled with happiness to get this award in his name. Thank you.
John, let me just say on behalf of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, we are very pleased to give you this prize for your optimistic view that humanity is always a flourishing opportunity if we give ourselves the opportunity to do that. So on behalf of us, let me give this to you.